Well, all right, we're in Daniel again, and so far we've seen Daniel's prayer, his preparation to receive the final vision in his book. Then last week we began to look at the vision of the angel and the explanation of what would happen in the future. And it's really based on Israel. God is telling Daniel that Israel wasn't going to be completely restored after the 70-year exile in Babylon. They are still a rebellious people, so the trouble they will experience is going to last all the way to the return of Christ at the end. And we saw a succession of kings that will control Israel and the Holy Land. But now we come to someone we've looked at before, Antiochus Epiphanes. This is an evil man, known as the Antichrist of the Old Testament, and we'll see why as we move on. So in our last study, we finished with the reign of the king of the north. Now we come to the next king that rises up after him, and as a reminder, remember we saw why this section with all these kings was so important? It's more than just a history lesson, isn't it? It shows that when God warns us about sin and rebellion, we need to pay heed. It teaches us that God's children will be punished for their rebellion. Israel was God's people, but the cost of rebelling against God, it was great, wasn't it? And his discipline towards them and his discipline towards us, it's always out of love. But the pain, as we see here, can just be incredible. If I could tell you the stories of the people I've sat across from in counseling, they say things like, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew God was telling me to stop, but I kept doing it anyway, and now my life has fallen apart. I've lost everything. So God's people were suffering because of their rebellion, because of their sin, because of their disobedience. They were being dominated by these kingdoms to the north and to the south. And Scripture tells us they are an example for us. In other words, we should learn from their experience so we don't have to go through it ourselves. That's 1 Corinthians 10:11. These things were written as an example to us. And you know what? We have a teaching today that says sin really doesn't matter. Oh, it's going to hurt your rewards, but you're all right. But let me say this. Of course, sin matters and should never be taken lightly. Listen to John Piper and how he defines sin. What is sin? It is the glory of God not honored, the holiness of God not reverenced, the greatness of God not admired, the power of God not praised, the truth of God not sought, the wisdom of God not esteemed, the beauty of God not treasured, the goodness of God not savored, the faithfulness of God not trusted, the commandments of God not obeyed, the justice of God not respected, the wrath of God not feared, the grace of God not cherished, the presence of God not prized, the person of God not loved. That is sin. John Bunyan put it this way: sin is the dare of God's justice, the rape of his mercy, the jeer of his patience, the slight of his power, and the contempt of his love. So do you really think something like that wouldn't matter to God? Of course it does. Now, with all that said, let's move to what God has to say about Antiochus Epiphanes. And we have already met him in Daniel 8, verses 9 through 14, and saw that his character and his activities are a picture or a type of the future Antichrist. Now look at Daniel 11:21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Daniel 11:21 in the New King James Version is a bit clearer, and it says, and in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So it says in his place. And so the angel told Daniel that after the brief reign of the former king of the north, Seleucus III, another would ascend to the throne who would be a vile, contemptible person. This is Antiochus IV, who took on the title Epiphanes, which means the illustrious or glorious one. So he calls himself the illustrious or glorious one, but God through his angel calls him vile and contemptible. Now, what happened to Seleucus? How did this opening to the throne come about? Now, it was suspected, now nobody knew for sure, but it was suspected that Antiochus Epiphanes murdered Seleucus III, his older brother, or had him murdered by someone else. But after this happened, it says he wasn't given the honor of royalty. Well, why? Because he wasn't the successor to the throne. He wasn't given that honor because he wasn't next in line. But still, he was able to ascend to the throne, and let's see how. We are told he didn't use power like people suspected he did with his older brother, murdering him. Instead, he shall come in peaceably. Now, he was very deceitful and crafty in the way he did this. Seleucus, who was murdered, had a son also named Antiochus, who was still a baby in Syria, but he was next in line. So Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, posed as his guardian. Just taking care of the next king. I just want what's best for him and his kingdom. But it just so happens that young Antiochus ended up being murdered by a man named Andronicus, whom Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, had put to death. I mean, how convenient, right? But many believe Antiochus had arranged the whole thing, the murder of the child and the murder of his murderer. But again, nobody knew for sure. I mean, Antiochus was deceitful and apparently good at covering his tracks. So he comes in peaceably with an appearance of gentleness. It also says he came in with flattery. Now, flattery means smooth methods or slippery ways. So he started cozying up to the right people, buttering them up. Adam Clarke in his commentary adds these historic details. He flattered Eumenes, king of Pergamus, and Attalus, his brother, and got their assistance. He flattered the Romans and sent ambassadors to court their favor and pay them the arrears of the tribute. He flattered the Syrians and gained their concurrence. And through it all, he continued to rise in power to become a force to be reckoned with. Look at verse 22. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. So he was victorious over his enemies, including the enemies to the south, devastating the Egyptians and their king. Then it says he even killed the prince of the covenant. Now, who is that? Well, this is the high priest of Israel, Onias. So Antiochus wanted to control even the priesthood in Israel. So he ordered the assassination of the priest and put his own man who supported him in his place. Again, we have this incredible accuracy of this prophecy. Onias was killed in 172 BC. So one step at a time, Antiochus Epiphanes is gaining power, not only defeating Egypt, but also controlling the priesthood in Israel. Now he starts adding to his power by making alliances with other nations. Look at verse 23 and 24. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So Antiochus Epiphanes, this man lacked character. So even in this, he is acting deceitfully. He's signing treaties with various nations, but as soon as it was to his advantage, he broke them. For example, he had entered into an alliance with Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, but suddenly decided to invade Egypt and Galilee when he thought he could be victorious there. And even though it says he was strong with small people, in other words, he didn't have a huge army. His army was small. He still enjoyed a great victory. Then to make friends in high places with the influential, he distributed part of his booty to the wealthy. And at the end of verse 24, we get a glimpse into his military strategy. It says he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So Antiochus planned to take all the major Egyptian fortress cities, all the strongholds. Now he had already had great success in Egypt, but you know what? He wanted all of it. He wanted total control. But it says, but only for a time. Just like the Antichrist in Revelation, God drew a line. You will have success for this long and no longer. Now we begin to see in verse 25 his growth in power. He had a small army before, but now it is a great army. Look at verse 25 through 27, and here we see his military conquest. And now remember, he has taken Galilee and some parts of Egypt, and he did this deceitfully, breaking his covenant with them, and he did it with a small army. But now he enters the Egyptian kingdom with brute force. He wants it all. And if he could do so much with so little, just think of what he could do with this new military might. Then look at verse 25 and 26. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. For plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And so the Egyptian king Ptolemy had been taken off guard before. He didn't expect Antiochus to break the covenant they had together. He trusted him. But this time it is different. Ptolemy has also assembled a massive, mighty army. But we're told he will not stand, and history confirms that he was defeated, and Antiochus took most of Egypt. He controlled everything but the city of Alexandria. But why was Ptolemy defeated even though he had such a huge army? What says plots were devised against him. Those who ate with him, his closest advisors, turned against him, resulting in his army being swept away and many being killed. But why did they turn against him? Well, because Antiochus was a master of intrigue. He was able to infiltrate the king's ranks and through flattery and bribery turn his most trusted counselors against him. Look at verse 27. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. So Antiochus failed to take all of Egypt. So he decided to sit down at the bargaining table with Egyptian leaders. But neither of the kings planned on keeping their words. They were just trying to gain advantage. They were lying. That's what it says. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. So these kings are doing their best to control the future for themselves, but it's to no avail. They aren't in control. That's what it's saying. They aren't in control. The Lord is. And everything is going to work out according to the Lord's appointed time. There is a divine timetable. There is a divine purpose, and God is going to have his way here. Plus, Israel was still under judgment because of their sin. So God is still working out his purposes and is going to use Antiochus to do it. The scheming and plotting of these men then, who think they are so clever, is not going to change God's timing and God's purposes. So just as God raised up Nebuchadnezzar against Israel when they rebelled, now he's going to do the same thing with Antiochus Epiphanes. And you know what? We can struggle with that, can't we? God using such evil men as Antiochus and Nebuchadnezzar. But we must remember that when we struggle, the problem is we're not quite as bright as God. He is perfect in his wisdom and in his planning. Therefore, he never makes a mistake. Everything he does is the right thing to do. In other words, it couldn't be done in a better way. So Antiochus heads back to Syria with great wealth, but his heart is set against Israel. Why? Because he's God's instrument of chastisement, God's ordained tool to discipline Israel. So God has put in his heart the desire to attack the Holy Land. And so let's look at the wrath against Israel. Daniel 11:28. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So he enters Israel, the Holy Land, and plunders the temple, and he stops the daily sacrifices that were taking place there. He killed many of the Jews, and then when he left soldiers behind to keep control. Then look at verse 29 through 30. At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. So it says, at the appointed time, this is God moving again, Antiochus decided to invade Egypt again. He wanted to finish the job. But this time the Romans, that's the ships of Kittim, confronted him and told him to stop. And he obeyed grudgingly, but on the way back to Syria, he took out his anger on the Jews. And this time it was brutal. It says, he shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Well, what's that talking about? Well, there will be Jewish traitors who forsake their own holy covenant to help him. It says he will pay attention to them. In other words, he will reward them generously for their support. Then in verse 31, we see him pouring out his hatred on the Jews. Look at verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. On December 14th, 168, on the Sabbath, When thousands of worshipers were attending to their religious duties, he attacked Jerusalem. His troops overwhelmed the city. They tore down buildings and spread terror amongst the inhabitants. Antiochus then issued a decree calling on everyone, on pain of death, to join in a universal religion and obey universal laws. So everyone had to conform to the Greek religion. He then desecrated the temple. He erected an altar to Zeus and offered a pig as a sacrifice. And the angel calls this the abomination that makes desolate. He also stopped all the Jewish sacrifices and any observance of the Sabbath or religious ceremonies. He destroyed copies of the scriptures and demanded that he be worshipped. Now you see why they call him the Antichrist of the Old Testament, right? And we saw earlier that he was a forerunner, a type of what the future Antichrist would do. That Antichrist in the final 7 years will break his covenant with the Jews in the middle of the tribulation period, and in the same way he will stop the daily sacrifices and will go into the Holy of Holies and put his own image there. And at that point, he will claim to be God and demand to be worshipped. And what the Antichrist does in the tribulation period is so similar to what we see in Antiochus. So Antiochus definitely had the spirit of the Antichrist, didn't he? Satan was pouring his hate for the Jews and their religion into him and through him. And think of this, the desecration of the temple by Antiochus, that was as bad as it gets for the Jew. And the fact God allowed it was proof of his displeasure. They had toyed with compromise, sin, and rebellion, and had refused to listen to the divine warnings that were given out of love, and the cost was great. But it gets worse. To add to all this, chapels to idols were set up all over the land. The Jewish people were expected to burn incense to the gods of Greece. If they refused or were found with a copy of the scriptures, they were put to death without mercy. What a time of testing, right? They were forced to choose God and possibly be slain, or submit to Antiochus and live as traitors to God. Now next we see two classes of people, those who turned against God, and we'll see how Antiochus treated them, and those who chose to follow God, even though the cost was great. Look at verse 32. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. And so there were those apostate Jews who followed him, even admired him. They had turned against God long ago, so desecrating his temple now. So what? And Antiochus seduced them with flattery, strengthening his ties with them. But God always has his remnant, doesn't he? Those who stand with him, and we see them also in verse 32. So look at verse 32, and now we'll go through verse 35. The people who know their God shall stand firm and take action, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So, those who really knew him took a stand against this evil. They chose to follow God regardless of the consequences. And this passage mentions the wise amongst the people who made many understand. Now there arose a new kind of people. They were called the Mashalim, the wise. And they understood the scriptures and that the prophecy Daniel wrote about was being fulfilled just like God said it would. So they understood God was involved and still alive in Israel. And this understanding helped them to continue to trust God even in the midst of their suffering and persecution. And they truly did pay a cost for their faithfulness to God. They experienced the wrath of the king. They died in the most cruel ways. They were roasted alive, crucified, and strangled. Some were sold into slavery. But out of all of this, you know what happened? A Jewish revolt grew, led by a Jewish priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons. His son Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, was a hero of this revolt. And they were able to gather an army together, and they started to fight back. And many died fighting for their city, their temple, and their faith, but eventually they were victorious. On December 14th, 165, the temple was purified and the altar dedicated once again to God. And the Jews celebrate this occasion annually as the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah. Now look at verse 34, and this is speaking of that time of the Maccabean revolt. Verse 34, when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And so the first part of this verse speaks of the beginning of the revolt against Antiochus and his army. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. Now that's probably referring to the small number of forces at the beginning of the revolt that were uniting together against Antiochus. They weren't great in number, but they were standing together in unity. Now the second part refers to the Maccabean revolt once it grew in strength. Many uncommitted Jews sided with the rebels out of expediency. They flattered the Maccabeans to gain their favor and acceptance. Now the final verse in this passage is interesting. Look at verse 35. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Now, why is God allowing this? Or why is God doing this? Well, it tells us right there, to refine, to purify, and to make white. Unfortunately, for many, this is necessary. They won't turn to God unless God turns up the heat of suffering. And this is the history of Israel, isn't it? They would get blessed, but then they would start to compromise. God would warn them, and then he would be forced to bring in suffering, which would turn them back to him, and then they'd get blessed again, but they'd start to compromise. They would get warned, and then God would have to bring in suffering again. I mean, you see that repeated again and again in the Old Testament. But notice how long this testing will last, until the time of the end. So the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes is not the time of the end. Therefore, this prophecy is not being completely fulfilled right here like some suggest. And remember, Daniel thought the 70 years would end the suffering of his people, but the angel has corrected that now. After the 70 years, there will be this succession of kings who dominate the Holy Land, including the evil Antiochus Epiphanes. But now get this is going to continue on until the end, until that appointed time, which takes us to the Antichrist, the tribulation period, and the return of Christ. So this is saying God is not finished with the purging process for Israel. And this is why it's hard for Israel and the Jew, because the purging is still going on right now. But here's the thing. We must see that this suffering that's been sent by God is gracious and loving. Why? Because God has every right to forget the Jew. He sent them the prophets and they rejected their words. He personally stooped down to them through the incarnation and they rejected his love. They dishonored him and despised his ways, causing the Gentiles to blaspheme him. But God didn't write them off, did he? This purging process is going to continue until the end of time, the appointed time. But at the end of the tribulation there, God is going to deal with Israel. And there is just an incredible promise. Paul says in Romans 11, all Israel shall be saved. So he is going to return, and all the Jews who made it through the tribulation period, who didn't take the mark, he will open their eyes. They will recognize him as their Messiah. And then the wonderful promise of Zechariah 13:1 will take place. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. So on that day, they're going to mourn for their sins and they're going to genuinely repent. They will return to God and be graciously saved. But now they are in the time of purging. But that day is going to be wonderful. It's going to be glorious. The nation is going to turn back to God. Well, let's conclude this then. What have we seen? Well, we've seen why it's been so difficult for the Jew. Read their history, and it is one that is filled with suffering, and it is filled with their continuous rejection of the true God and their Messiah, Jesus Christ. But God said that is how it would be, and it will continue like that until the time their Messiah returns to earth. At that time, the veil will be removed from their eyes. That hardness towards God that is a result of sin, that's going to be removed. They will look upon Jesus and know he is their Messiah, and on that day, they will be forgiven and restored. God will be their God, and they will be his people. What a future. It's glorious, isn't it? Well, all right, guys, thanks again. Hit those buttons. And if you want to help support the channel so we can continue to do this, the links are in the description. God bless you. I love you, and I'll see you in the next video.